like to go?
I reckon to go. Yeah.
All right. No, thanks, Julian, and thanks to the committee for having me. All right. Look, I just here's the plan of the talk. Is that's in the way? Is it? Can we shift that?
Just talk over the side.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. I just want to get rid of this one here, though. Hey. Okay, great. Very good. Okay, thanks. Look, this is the plan of the talk. So look, I might just launch into it. What role should empirical methods play in political philosophy? What might be the merits of employing the methods of the social sciences to address the fundamental questions about, for instance, the nature of good society, or what makes the state politically legitimate? And these are the kinds of questions that political philosophers explore. A useful point of comparison here is political science. Although political science and political philosophy are closely adjacent disciplines, political scientists typically make far greater use of empirical methods. Moreover, many political scientists are highly critical, and not just political scientists, social scientists, are highly critical of what they see as the unacceptable or unacceptably a prioristic methods of a great deal of contemporary political philosophy. The criticism here is that political philosophy is not sufficiently empirical, and concomitant with it is a rejection of the a priori methods that political philosophers in the analytic tradition employ. Such critics either want the discipline to be transformed so as to incorporate more empirical material, or to be rejected entirely because the questions being asked are not well formed. All right, so, and I'll just work my way through this, but all right, so, well, they're not meaningful or useful. On the former approach, the questions are significant, the approach is flawed, while the latter approach dismisses the questions in and of themselves. However, such criticisms are, of course, highly contentious and contested. Many political philosophers are opposed, on primarily normative grounds, to such moves which they regard as embodying the methodological vice of scientism. And it's just a little, and they sort of encroach. Look, you know, in a way, these are when I'm talking about scientism and empiricism and so on. I probably need to be a little bit less loose about the way that I'm defining them. But when I'm talking about scientism, there's a definition here from Susan Hack, and she calls scientism a kind of over-enthusiastic and uncritically deferential attitude towards science, an inability to see or an unwillingness to acknowledge its fallibility, its limitations, its potential dangers. Now, it's a very persuasive definition in that sense. It's, you know, there's a moral critique built into it. When I'm talking about scientism, the kind of scientism I have in mind is those that want to make, well, in this case, political philosophy more empirical. All right, so I tend to jump a little bit between the two of them. All right, now while it represents a distinct category, scientism, which I say is defined by Hack in persuasive terms, is clearly related to empiricism, at least in this context. If we assume that the methods of the sciences and the success of the sciences are due to empirical methods, then enthusiasm for science is presumably enthusiasm for empiricism. Now, what should we think? Might there be specifically political reasons for rejecting such empiricist or scientific pressures in political philosophy based on the methodological positions? Is scientism politically vicious, understood as the way that I was just talking about it there? And more generally, there's a question whether methodology in political philosophy could be political. Some critics, and here I have in mind those influenced by the so-called Frankfurt School and by thinkers like Jürgen Habermas, although not only the Frankfurt School thinkers, want to make a more general point about the pernicious influence of certain empiricist moves in philosophy, and political philosophy is the one I'm looking at in particular. For such critics, methodology to court is political, and these criticisms should be contrasted with more straightforwardly non-political philosophical grounds for objecting to strong empiricist programs of methodological reform in political philosophy. So the questions I want to explore here, there's three questions, and it's sort of, in that sense, can be a little bit of a Cook's tour around some topics that are related. But what objections do various empiricists have to the methods used by political philosophers who work in the analytic tradition? And I'll briefly look at some of those. Might we be able to employ political critiques to defend traditional analytic political philosophy? All right. And the third question, more generally, are the methodological approaches adopted in any form of humanistic inquiry necessarily political? All right, so my starting point then is that philosophical and methodological criticisms of political philosophy that are concerned with the need for greater empirical content. And I'll just give I'll begin with an overview of some recent arguments in favour of making political philosophy more like political science, developed by critics of philosophy from the social science. Later, I'm going to, in a more historical mode, I'll consider the disagreement between the Vienna Circle and the Frankfurt School on whether philosophy should model itself on the natural sciences. And I'll focus particularly here on their diametrically opposed views about the political implications of such positivism. And I suggest that these debates from the 1930s sheds considerable light, or some light at least, upon current questions about method. Both groups regarded our methodological choices as essentially political. I think this is a mistake. I argue that the real lesson we should draw from these debates is that any connection between method and specific positions on the political spectrum is wholly contingent. This is simply to assert that methodology is in the end orthogonal to any substantive concrete political views. Though, I mean methodology in general. There can be methodological positions that clearly have political implications. However, that's not the end of the matter. Despite the aforesaid concession of the contingency of the relation between method and concrete politics, nonetheless, there are plausible philosophical grounds and political grounds for resisting the wholesale adoption of the methods of social science. And later in the talk, I'll lay out some arguments as to why this is so. And at the heart of the argument, what I call the immunity thesis. I'll say more about that a little bit in a minute. But anyway, look, a couple of points to note about the adopt approach here. While the focus is primarily upon political philosophy, we'll necessarily be flitting between more general philosophical claims and specifically political ones. Secondly, there's no sense in which the discussion here involves a repudiation or rejection of science. Rather, it is simply a matter of, in Richard Fumerton's terms, rendering unto science what is properly scientific and rendering unto philosophy what is philosophical. And I think this is an important point to make, given the attacks upon science which developed during the COVID pandemic and which have accelerated with the rise of anti-intellectual right-wing governments in many parts of the world. And here I'm thinking most notably of the US. So, look, I'm hoping the discussion's of interest. I'm bringing together concerns from political theory and political philosophy with some more methodological topics explored in mainstream analytic philosophy in recent years. If nothing else, I hope it initiates some debate about the political significance of method. All right, so what I want to do in this next section is just outline a critique of political philosophy, the essence of which is that the use of a prioristic methods of philosophy is inappropriate in the analysis of political and social formations. I just want to step back a little bit, though. First of all, think about what I'm talking about in political philosophy. Maybe some of this is pretty mundane or quotidian or whatever. Political philosophy is traditionally conceived as the study of fundamental questions about the state, government, politics, liberty, distributive justice, and the enforcement of a legal code by authority. It's useful here to contrast political philosophy with the way that political science proceeds. And I think the following three questions might well be regarded as paradigm cases of topics in political philosophy. What makes the distribution of goods across a society just or fair? What makes a government legitimate? And what is freedom of speech, and why should governments protect it? So I think there's just three paradigm cases of, or questions that philosophers in political philosophy talk about. And one striking feature of the discipline is the use of very non-empirical tools like thought experiments and conceptual analysis. All right, so there's a social science critique of political philosophy, the essence of which is that the use of those methods that I'm just talking about is inappropriate in the analysis of political and social formations. The critique with which I'm concerned involves the apparently non-empirical nature of political philosophy, or a great deal of what we do in political philosophy. It's a critique to be found in the writings of empirically minded social scientists who believe that the methods of social sciences should be extended to other areas of the humanities, including political philosophy. And there's a book that I've spent a little bit of time looking at by King, Keohane and Verba called Designing Social Inquiry. And I've just got that it's in their work. And I just got a couple of quotes. I mean, here, this is, they argue, this is Designing Social Inquiry from 1994, that a theory is not a theory unless it's able to generate testable hypotheses. All right. And I mean, here's a quote from the start of the book. So it's a whole book on designing social inquiry. And they say, good research, that is scientific research, can be quantitative or qualitative in style. All right, so that's the funny one. And I should say this is also a fairly key text in a lot of the social sciences. Okay, so good research, that is scientific research, can be quantitative or qualitative in style. In design, however, it has the following 4 characteristics, and then the 3 list 4 criteria. And 1 is the goal is inference, 2, the procedures are public, 3, the conclusions are uncertain, 4, the content is the method. No, I mean, number 2 and 3 there, you know, it's not necessarily problematic, but the way that this is not just saying this is one way of doing research, they're saying this is the way to do social, you know, research in relationship to social institutions and political institutions. So one of the things they say is the goal is inference. Scientific research is designed to make descriptive or explanatory inferences on the basis of empirical information about the world. And I think writers such as these are part of a long tradition of positivism within the social sciences that maintains that advances in the humanities and social sciences can only occur by modelling themselves on the sciences. And that's what I was sort of running together and talking about this scientism and empiricism, but it's scientism understood as, you know, overdue deference for science and desire to make, you know, all inquiry in the, you know, follow the form of the sciences. All right, I think that there's also, as we probably know, there's the intellectual influences. There's just a general, let's say, what's in the air, as it were. I mean, there's often a tendency to want to reject the methods of philosophy as being too loose, I suppose. You know, the idea of the critique is that the lack of empirical rigour within political philosophy renders it, in some important sense, to be intellectually legitimate. A more moderate view, but still which wishes to make philosophy more empirical, is to be found in the work of Keith Dowding, who's at the ANU. And if you look at his 2016 book, The Philosophy and Methods of Political Science, and in a 2020 article in the Australian Journal of Political Science entitled The Relationship Between Political Science, Political Philosophy and Political Science, and I'll just read this quote. He says, modern analytic liberal political philosophy is all too often moral philosophy generalised to political questions. So he objects to moral philosophy being the basis of it. It's too much focused on individual behaviour and too little on that of the state. In this, I'm a normative political realist, suggesting that the fundamental normative principles of political philosophy are not the same as the fundamental normative principles of personal morality. Second, given a more direct political target, political philosophy needs to take greater account of the findings in political science. These are not simply facts, but rather our knowledge of, they involve our knowledge of causal mechanisms as both the social psychological level and the institutional level. In this regard, I think political philosophy, without losing its humanistic, its normative character, needs to be more scientific. And there's a more moderate view, and it's not really the view that I'm particularly concerned with. But this kind of view, the political philosophy needs to take more account of the empirical details of those institutions in which the philosophical disputes are embedded, and of the empirical details more generally that are related to those disputes. It's not the view with which I want to take issue. So I just want to say that it's a more radical view, the sort of thing you find in, like, the book Designing Social Inquiry. Now, what they might be advocating? I mean, one idea is that political philosophy might be transformed into a social science. So philosophy should incorporate the methods of empirical science, either because it's what counts as reputable research, or that's how we make research becomes futile. Another way is just to say political philosophy vanquished. Somebody might want to say, and you hear this at times, it's disreputable and its methods are disreputable because it does not involve empirical methods. Hence, we should cease asking the questions that philosophers ask. There's a third, and so it's not, in the second case, it's not that we're answering the questions in the wrong way, it's that the questions aren't relevant or important questions. The third position here, and this actually is more in philosophical method, but David Papineau, talking about method and naturalism, says that, as it turns out, that philosophy does actually use the same methods. I mean, I've always found it a slightly implausible view, but I'm just laying that out for kind of covering the logical geography. Okay, So what I want to do now is actually shift to a critique. And this is basically the Frankfurt School critique of that kind of empiricism and positivism. And it's the idea of what's involved here is in these kinds of cases where people are pushing towards modelling it more on the sciences. It's a form of technical, what's sometimes called the critique of technical instrumental reason. Maybe I should call it, I mean, at times I thought maybe I should be just calling it empiricist encroachment. The terms scientism, positivism, empiricism obviously have got other connotations. But so part of the thing I want to look at here is, okay, what's wrong with this? Is there a reason for objecting to that? How do we object to that kind of move that's going on by people by various people that want to make political philosophy far more empirical? That is, can we make a political critique of views which would eliminate forms of practical reasoning about the ends of activities? Now, one of the things about this kind of a critique, I mean, it's a critique of all forms of positivism, and it's what some on the left might call a totalising critique. And the suggestion is that in this kind of methodological approach, is that this kind of methodological approach necessarily leads to conservative political philosophy, or at least an inability to engage in critical social inquiry. So the critique here is that if you go down this encroaching empiricism, this scientific view, what happens is you either end up in conservative political views, or at least you end up in a situation where there's an inability to engage in critical social inquiry. And the assumption is that those who adopt such a methodological approach will be committed, thereby, to conservative political views. That's one take, they're actually going to be conservative politically, or it might take away the possibility for critical public discourse or discussions. And I think underpinning this is a more general claim, but that if you hold certain kinds of methodological, metaphysical views, you're committed to specific political views or provide blocks on certain political discussions. I mean, this is certainly the case when I was first a student, that, and some of you would have come across this, where there was a debate between methodological individualists and methodological holists in the social sciences when I was a student. And, it's whether in analysing socio-historical events, should you be looking at, properties of individuals within those societies, or should you be looking at certain kinds of larger collective entities, all right? And to take an example that was used at the time, I mean, a lot of people used to, Laura's going to object to this, but there used to be a kind of view that Latin American politics had to be, the problem with Latin American politics had to be a consequence of the, hot-tempered Latin personalities. It had nothing to do with, US intervention or whatever, at the time. But that's a very methodological individualist view, that somehow you can analyse socio-historical events in terms of the individual properties of the people that make up that collective. Obviously, I'm being a bit critical of that. But, and the other view is the methodological holist view that was talked about in the 80s, pretty much, was the idea that you analyse in terms of class or social institutions, institutional frameworks and structures. But what you get there is two different ways of analysing society, and obviously a lot of people would see that as having political connotations. Right? So that if you're a methodological individualist, it said something about the kinds of political views that you endorse. Right? Similarly, I am going back a long way here, there was a time when, and I don't know what people's take on this is, but there was a time when being a dualist, like a metaphysical dualist, was seen as a sign of being politically conservative. The great Australian tradition of being materialist was not only seen as an intellectually correct, but also politically correct in that sense. So and what I'm saying is that these sorts of ideas shouldn't be alien to us. I mean, the idea that method is political, right? And there've been lots of debates over the years about, or that metaphysical questions or abstract theories can actually have political implications. And that's the question partly I want to explore. As I said, metaphysical dualism, women committed to conservative political views. That was kind of view that I remember as an undergraduate. All right, so some key Frankfurt School thinkers. Some of the people that just talk about here, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Habermas. All right, so as I say, the ideas shouldn't be unfamiliar. People undertook political social theory in the 70s, 80s, 90s. One way of defending political philosophy as a philosophical enterprise is to avail oneself of the views of these characters, of the Frankfurt School, and in particular their criticisms of the logical empiricism of the Vienna Circle, as a way of attacking the empiricism of the social sciences. And you find this very much in the work of Horkheimer and Marcuse, but probably most significantly in the work of Habermas. And so Habermas is still alive. I think this is relevant to the question what might be wrong with I'm calling encroaching empiricism. Habermas argued that a picture of enlightenment rationality wedded to domination only arises if we conflate instrumental rationality with rationality as such. And so I've left this bit of the last slide there, but different forms of reason, there were different forms of reason. In the early work, he distinguished between technical instrumental reason, practical reason, and emancipatory reason. And this is particularly in the book Knowledge and Human Interests. He contrasts three cognitive interests: the technical interest, the practical interest, and the emancipatory interest. And I think it mirrors a lot of kind of ideas you find in, say, Aristotle between techne and praxis. But he adds another one, the emancipatory interest, in his early work, which is basically critical theory and Marxism. All right, so there was technical interest, which is about making things happen. The practical interest was about discussing the ends of activity, I suppose. And then in this early work, he had this idea of an emancipatory interest, which was the idea of, how should we live? What sort of society should we live in? Later, he comes to distinguish between communicative action, rationality on the one hand, and instrumental and strategic action on the other. So the debate becomes between it's twofold rather than threefold. All right, now, so what you might do, and what the Frankfurt School did was to look at that kind of empiricist projects and positivist projects and say that they're politically suspect. And there's a certain kind of plausibility of it. Either, in terms of making certain forms of political critique inadmissible, that there's certain questions that can't be asked or explored, or even concrete substantive views. And you can see this in a way their attacks, and Horkheimer in particular, I'll say a little bit more about this in a minute, but Horkheimer attacked the Vienna Circle, vigorously. There's interesting work on this. I'll say a little bit more in a minute, by Thomas Wiebel and John O'Neill, looking at the interactions between the Frankfurt School and the Vienna Circle. And there were meetings between Horkheimer and Neurath. And I think Neurath always felt that if you read the stories, that he was betrayed by Horkheimer in this sense. So they were all broadly on the left. So, and this, in the late 20s and early 30s in Vienna. If you think about Carnap's distinction between internal and external questions, all right, which a lot of you will be well aware of, philosophical questions and political philosophical questions become external questions, and in that sense, not ones we can meaningfully address. So what I'm saying is the Frankfurt School critique has got a certain amount of plausibility because of, one of the things about the Vienna Circle is it does seem, in principle, that it leads to at least some sort of quietism with respect to political issues. All right, there's an article on the icy slopes of logical positivism, and it notes that in the 1950s, that logical positivism, at least in the US, was responsible for remarkably right-wing and undemocratic politics. Okay, so there you've got an attitude towards logical empiricism, you've an attitude towards that kind of project of trying to make things more scientific. But Neurath actually, this is where John O'Neill and Thomas Wiebel have spent a lot of time working on. Neurath was actually, and many of you might be well aware of this, was very politically active, right? And he was not a right-wing figure at all. He was involved, he was a finance minister in the Bavarian Social Republic after World War I. He was trying to bring in a new system of non-monetary, organisation of the government at the time, immediately after the First World War. He was a very, very active political figure. He actually invented some kind of sign symbol. They're like the signs we have up here. I'm not sure I don't want to make the claim that he was initially the person, but he went to the, I'm not going to make a historical claim, but he was an important figure in the creation of hieroglyphs or whatever you call those things. And his idea was sort of a democratic idea that a lot of signs people who couldn't read couldn't have access to. So his idea was to make, for those who are less literate, be able to see. And he actually got funding from the Soviet Union in the early 30s and went over there. And, these things were brought into place. I mean, I think some of you are nodding your head. So it's interesting. Neurath's politics were not what you would expect. There's an interesting article, The Technocratic Socialism of Otto Neurath and the Jacobin by Gareth Dale. If you're interested. All right. So the point I want to make is that the Vienna Circle had political views and they had normative politics, which by their own lights, in some sense, you might think they shouldn't hold. I was going to mention Carnap, but though it was a little bit later than this. Carnap had developed a form of scientific humanism, and it was like a welfare. It was the theory that with science we could develop an account of a rational way of providing benefits to people. Right? It was a form of welfare humanism. And again, I didn't include it here because it's a little bit, that stuff happened later than the period that I'm interested in. But again, Carnap's an arch, central figure of the Vienna Circle, and he had quite substantive views about the way that science could be used to bring about, improve the world. I think one of the things that went on here was that they were concerned or horrified by the conservatism of the church in Austria at the time. And they rejected the ideas of metaphysics and morality to court. I think that's part of what went on with Vienna Circle when you read it. I mean, they associated metaphysics with the Catholic metaphysics. They associated morality with the sort of morality of the church, and kind of rejected that. I mean, here I would want to suggest that they conflated conceptions of morality and metaphysics with the concept of morality and the concept of metaphysics in a sort of way that Rawls talks about conceptions of justice and the concept of justice. I think what went on there was that they rejected it. Anyway, O'Neill and Weibull argue that they have been unfairly caricatured as being apolitical or politically conservative because their views about apolitical or political conservative nature of logical empiricism. All right, now, what they run the line is that interestingly, there was an article, sorry, there was a journal, an issue, it was volume 6 of the Journal for Social Research, which Max Horkheimer was editing, and it was published in 1937. And it had papers by both Neurath and Horkheimer. And Neurath's paper, Inventory of the Standard of Living, outlines Neurath's criticisms of attempts to capture welfare with monetary valuations. Okay, that's what Neurath was on about. Horkheimer's paper was the latest attack on metaphysics, and it was a savage critique of positivism as was being developed by the Vienna Circle at the time. So I think this is historically interesting anyway. And O'Neill and Weibull say that the paper also marked an important turning point in the history of the reception of the work of the Vienna Circle, providing the starting point for the now familiar picture of the logical empiricists, especially in left circles, as committed to a technocratic and instrumentalist view of politics, unable to sustain any critical standpoint on existing society. Now, and this is something we talk about at the end, is what's the relationship between, method in this sense and substantive political views. I would take it that there's no necessary connection. Now, you might think what the problem is here is that, either weakness of will on their part or they didn't stick to their, that they weren't following through their commitments. If they were seriously committed to, a kind of positivism of the kind that they adverted to, then they shouldn't be engaging the kind of political activity that they are, maybe. But I think partly the interesting thing here is whether or not political views or metaphysical views, methodological views are actually have substantive political implications. So, you might think this is interesting historically, but so what? Do these count as counterexamples of what? Do abstract theories entail particular commitments? Right. Now, what is it evidence of? Now, interesting, there's an article a couple of years ago by a North American sociologist, Federico Brandmeier, and I don't know anything else about him other than he wrote this article, but he wrote, the article I'm just going to refer to is called Are Theories Politically Flexible? And he begins by asking whether we should see any entailment between a theory and a course of political action. And this is a nice quote here. He goes, politicians, revolutionaries, managers, judges, terrorists, and many others regularly invoke theories in support of a political goal. Some take their claims as clear indication there's something logical or inevitable about the pairing between a theory and a political project. But is that so? Does a theory compel its users to act only in a certain way to defend only one political project? Or can a theory be used to make opposite political claims? In other words, are theories politically flexible? And he goes on to talk about how some theories are in fact rigid and some are flexible. All right, so he thinks there are rigid theories and flexible theories, and some, certain kinds of theories, if you hold them, then they're necessarily going to entail certain political conclusions, and others are more flexible. And he thinks it depends on contingent features of both the theory and of the social context. And I think it's just interesting in this context to think about whether theories are flexible in that way. And if you go back to the point I was making before about methodological individualism, if you're a methodological individualist, does that mean you're necessarily of a particular political persuasion? All right, I just want to, and I have to keep an eye on the time here a little bit. So I want to come at, what time do we keep talking to? Probably
30s.
Yeah, I'm not going to go that way. Yeah, okay, cool. All right, look, I want to go a slightly different path here. I do want to maintain that there are political reasons for being concerned with, what I was calling encroaching empiricism, or certain kinds of ways of regarding method. But at the same time, I don't want to make the kind of radical critique that somebody like the Frankfurt School do. So what I want to first of all do is say what I think's wrong, not politically, but just actually methodologically wrong with those kinds of views. All right, so I want to make three claims. All right, so with respect to methods of political philosophy, I want to make following claims. One's what I call the immunity thesis. So answers to the problems dealt with in philosophy, political philosophy, contain necessarily speculative elements, and those problems can't be resolved by the empirical methods typically of the sciences. And I'll actually read something out rather than go off the PowerPoint, so I'll just read a section out in a minute, just because it's clear a bit. All right, and these can be necessary and contingent immunity. So sometimes the problem's immune to empirical resolution because we haven't yet worked out a method for determining it, empirically, or we don't have access to relevant empirical material. In this sense, it's contingently immune. But there are other problems I want to suggest are necessarily immune to empirical resolution. All right, so I'll just start reading. All right, so the immunity thesis. Problems in political philosophy can't be solved fully or adequately responded to using scientific methods alone. I want to explore this in greater detail. Firstly, it's important to distinguish between necessary and contingent immunity. Sometimes the problem is immune to empirical resolution because not as yet worked out a method for determining it. We don't have access to relevant material, as I said above. In this sense, it's contingently immune. And hence we must use conceptual analysis or other speculative methods to determine a response or to understand a set of circumstances. For instance, imagine we're attempting to determine what determines different attitudes towards national sovereignty, and in particular, the role that class and economic power plays in our attitudes to sovereignty. In this case, we don't have access to relevant material, empirical data. We might speculate that those with an economic interest in trade with other countries are less likely to worry about how free trade undermines national sovereignty. In such circumstances, we might well use the resources of the armchair, as it were, to work out what role class plays in views of national sovereignty. And it's always possible to undertake a survey in this instance if we have the resources. But there are also cases where it's not technically feasible with our current methods of analysis to undertake the required survey or empirical work. And in those cases, the problem is contingently immune to empirical resolution. But there are also problems in political philosophy I would suggest that are necessarily immune to empirical resolution. The questions noted above, such as what counts as a just distribution or what makes government legitimate, can't be solved simply undertaking a survey or some other kind of empirical work. So just as an example, I've done a little bit of work on water and justice, and there's very applied recent debates about the just allocation of water. Often one encounters researchers in the social sciences and from agriculture working on justice. And what they mean is that they venture out into the world and undertake surveys, asking people what they think counts as a just allocation of water. This, they say, is what it means to undertake research into the nature of justice. Notice here that the question's been changed. They're not asking what justice is, but what people think justice is. The first question has a necessarily speculative element and cannot, without making speculative commitments about the nature of fairness itself, be resolved completely. There's a sleight of hand here going on which involves changing the question being examined. And I suggest that such a sleight of hand is common when theorists of an empirical bent claim to have solved some fundamental problem in political philosophy. Either they change the question or it's being asked, or there's a smuggling in of speculative material that's not empirical. With respect to the latter, think of the way that a great deal of this kind of work does in fact smuggle in unacknowledged meta-ethical assumptions. It would convene at this point to present a quick knockdown transcendental argument to demonstrate why these fundamental questions in political philosophy can't be resolved empirically. At this stage, I don't have one. It'd be nice to be able to say why some things are actually necessarily immune. In order to illustrate this claim about the ineradicable nature of the speculative philosophical material, it's useful to consider a debate about ethics and the empirical that arose in response to Joshua Green's famous 2002 experiments, in which he took MRI scans of subjects being asked to deliberate on a series of trolley problems. I mean, most of you know this stuff. It's from 20 years ago. As many of you will no doubt be aware, when subjects are asked what they would do if they had to choose between 5 people being killed and only one person being killed by a runaway trolley, and they have a lever which will ensure that only one person is killed, most people choose to pull a lever. Numbers count here. However, if they're asked if they would be willing, I mean, you know the story, they're willing to push a single person in front of a trolley to save 5, most people are horrified and refuse to engage in the action. In the second case, the numbers do not count. Now, so when Green took scans of the subjects' brains, when they were being asked these questions, he discovered the first kind of case, the parts of the brain that were operative were those associated with rational calculation, whereas in the second kind of case, it was those parts associated with emotions. Now, he uses the experiment to question, given the rather arbitrary nature of our intuitions, whether they're worth defending. However, Peter Singer, in an article in 2005 entitled Ethics and Intuitions, makes much stronger claims, supposedly based on empirical evidence. Singer notes that when the numbers count, our moral reasoning is fundamentally consequentialist, whereas when the numbers don't count, we're reasoning in a deontological manner. He also notes that in the former case, we're being rational, in the latter case, we're being emotional, and claims this is why consequentialism is superior to deontology. The claim here is that we have empirical evidence why consequentialism is superior to deontology. So, I mean, I don't wish to buy into that debate, but I mean, I think it's a sort of false use of the evidence. The reason here, of course, is rather swift, and one might wonder what's going on. Does this empirical evidence help solve the old philosophical debate between consequentialism and deontology? How could it? Closer examination reveals that the argument depends upon a valorisation of reason over the emotions, which itself is a highly contested speculative metaphysical assumption. Unsurprisingly, the argument doesn't follow from the empirical studies without mediation by contested philosophical assumptions. The experiments solve nothing without other philosophical commitments, and I'm reminded here of Salim Burke's rather sardonic comment in an article from 2009 called The Normative Insignificance of Neuroscience, which was that when historians look back in the first decade of the 21st century, they will dub it the age of the fMRI. And he then proceeds to pour scorn on the idea that these kinds of experiments solve normative puzzles. So in thinking about the immunity, it's also important to distinguish between strong and moderate immunity. According to strong immunity, the empirical has no role whatsoever to play in the resolution of our responses to problems in political philosophy. I think it's a very strong form of rationalism. But according to moderate immunity, which is what I want to defend, these issues can't be resolved entirely without using empirical resources alone, but require non-empirical input. It's moderate immunity that I endorse. Hence, the idea is not that the empirical has no role to play, but that the philosophical problems in political philosophy can't be resolved entirely using only empirical resources. Now, if this is true, this is something that we call the autonomy thesis. The autonomy thesis says that political philosophy has both a set of problems and a set of methods which are distinct from those of the sciences. One immediate objection to this view that might occur to some of you is, how does the autonomy thesis coexist with the apparent empirical element that seems to exist within political philosophy, in which I've just outlined? If political philosophy contains empirical reasoning, why think it's different from the sciences? I think the answer to this apparent puzzle is quite simple. I don't want to deny there are indeed empirical elements within political philosophy. As I just noted, when we apply general principles to the real world, then empirical material will be relevant. So how do we square the idea of autonomy thesis, according to which political philosophy has both a set of problems and methods which are distinct from those of the sciences, with the fact that we seem to employ empirical methods that seems remarkably similar to what goes on in the sciences? And at this point, I just propose a third thesis, which is the interaction thesis. Although distinct problems in political philosophy and scientific ones are not completely isolated from one another. Indeed, this would be exceedingly odd that they were. In many instances, such as those cited above in political philosophy, empirical information will be central to a proposed solution to a problem. And equally, many scientific problems will have substantive philosophical elements. So what I'm giving here is a methodological response to the elimination of the speculative, or at least a desire to make political philosophy a properly empirical exercise, all right, more akin to political science. It's a methodological defence to the a prioristic methods of political philosophy. The questions being asked cannot be properly answered without reference to non-empirical speculative ideals. All right, so I'm saying there's something problematic methodologically with that empiricist project. All right, just so I hadn't said, the best way to think about the relationship with political philosophy and empirical material is to think of a centre of gravity. The centre of gravity for political philosophy, and philosophy more general, I would suggest, involves a priori reasoning, whereas science, it's more empirical. All right, so just the critique. I mean, is scientism political vicious? What I just did give was what I think is methodologically wrong with the sort of empiricist project that I was described at the beginning. So I'm coming to the end of this, so please know. So with these lessons in mind, I'll show outline some ways in which the project of making inquiry largely, and in some cases extremely exclusively empirical, insofar as that's possible, and denying the non-empirical normative content can have negative political consequences. Here I consider economic theory, which is often presented as a positive empirical science, having eliminated the normative content as it moved away from its roots in utilitarian political theory. However, as many critics have noted over the years, normative conceptions for what counts as a good life, what counts as a good society, are built into the fundamental assumptions of economic theory. And when economic theory is used to determine public policy, then we find various normative claims being implicitly endorsed and implemented across society as a whole. But these are questions that should properly be part of a larger public discourse. There should be public debate about what conceptions of individual good lives we want to encourage and of the good society that should underpin the policies that our society adopts. These are properly matters of discussion, of democratic debate, not a topic to be determined by experts employing theories that contain unstated normative ideals. So the argument here depends on the claim defended in the previous section that in political philosophy, there are necessarily non-empirical speculative questions or elements that need to be addressed in implementing any policy. And that was the immunity thesis. If one employs theories that actively proclaim their purely empirical status, then if the theory is to be practically implemented, the required speculative questions must be dealt with covertly. What one finds is that normative assumptions are smuggled into the theory that purport to be value-free. And one consequence of this is that the normative questions about the kind of society we aspire to, that properly should be in the public domain, if we are to be democratically healthy, are determined by ideas that are built implicitly into these putatively value-free public policy frameworks. And this is the political harm that's to be found in the scientistic urge to make political philosophy an entire imperial exercise. All right, I just want to say a couple of points about, that was what I was calling the scientism objection in political philosophy. I think what's wrong with that kind of scientific is the sort of democratic deficit it gives rise to. I just want to end with, I've talk here, I was going to go back over what I said, but I just want some not conclusions so much, but maybe some thoughts about whether we should regard method as political. So finally, there's a question to which the title of this talk alludes, and which I discussed at the outset, namely the question of whether method should be regarded as political. What about method in general, not merely in political philosophy? The sociologist Federico Bahnmeyer, in the article I talked about before, suggests that some theories are political, flexible, and others rigid. Right. Now, the point I would endorse here is that in general, there's no reason to think that abstract theories in metaphysics, meta-ethics or methodology necessarily have political implications. Perhaps that should be the default position. There does seem to be, in Brandemir's sense, a certain amount of flexibility, at least in a lot of areas. However, I do think that once we move into areas that bear on our moral and political lives, then the way that we frame problems and the normative assumptions built into them, in the case that I've spoken about, is with respect to political questions about the good society and the justification of state coercion. In those cases, I think it changes. Brandemeier argues that it's sociologically contingent. I think it depends more upon the kind of questions we're exploring and the interests that are at play. And I think it's one of the lessons, for instance, feminism has taught us over the years about the way that views which appear neutral actually embed the values that in the long run are harmful to women. So in answer to the question, is method political? In many instances, yes. All right? But I think that just in saying that the default position probably should be that it's not political, but depending on what the context is. Anyway, so that's the end of that. Thank you.